Two cops abusing their power pulled over a black man's car. After a quick check, they arrested him for no reason. They thought they had an easy target. But what they didn't know, he ran the entire police department. The sound of tires humming against the pavement filled the quiet suburban street as Malcolm Hayes, a 50-year-old police chief, turned onto Magnolia Drive in Atlanta, Georgia. The crisp autumn air carried a faint scent of rain, and the orange glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns. It had been a long day, but a rewarding one. Malcolm had just finished a series of meetings with community leaders, discussions aimed at mending the strained relationship between the police department and the people it served. It wasn't an easy job, but he had spent decades in law enforcement believing that true justice began with accountability. That was why he had taken the position to fix a system from the inside out. He exhaled, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. Home was just 10 minutes away. He could already picture his wife, Denise, waiting with his favorite pot roast, a Sunday night tradition, even though it was Monday. Their daughter, Nia, had just started her first semester at Howard University, and Denise would undoubtedly have updates from their latest phone call. A small smile touched his lips as he eased his black SUV through the quiet streets. The vehicle was nothing flashy, a late-model Chevy Tahoe, government-issued but unmarked, a car chosen deliberately to avoid attention. But attention had found him anyway. Blue and red lights exploded in his rearview mirror, slicing through the darkness like an alarm bell. The familiar wail of a police siren shattered the quiet. Malcolm's hands tightened on the wheel for just a moment. He instinctively glanced at his speedometer, 30 miles per hour. The limit was 35. No rolling stop, no swerving, no reason at all. His pulse remained steady, but the weight of decades of experience settled on his shoulders. Stay calm. Follow the protocol. He signaled, pulling over smoothly to the side of the road, the crunch of gravel beneath his tires breaking the eerie silence that followed. This wasn't the first time he had been pulled over, but it was the first time since he had become the highest-ranking officer in the department. Malcolm inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower. He knew the drill. Hands visible. Movements slow. Polite but firm demeanor. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because in situations like this, appearances meant everything. Through the rearview mirror, he watched as two officers emerged from the squad car. Their body language was aggressive, one moving toward his window, the other hanging back near his rear bumper, hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon. That second officer, the one near the trunk, that was a tell. They don't know who I am. And that meant they thought they were in control. Malcolm kept his face neutral, his grip light on the wheel, as the first officer, Officer Bradley, approached the driver's side window, flashlight in hand. The harsh white beam cut through the dim interior, landing on Malcolm's face, lingering a second too long. Bradley was young, eager, with a chip on his shoulder. His uniform was crisp, his movements sharp, his stance just a little too aggressive for a routine traffic stop. "You in a hurry tonight?" Bradley's voice dripped with suspicion, his tone already leaning toward antagonism. Malcolm met his gaze with the same calm he had perfected over years of facing situations just like this. "No, sir," he replied evenly. "Just heading home." The flashlight moved, sweeping across Malcolm's lap, over the dashboard, checking for contraband, weapons, anything to justify the stop. Nothing. License and registration. The demand came clipped, impatient, entitled. Not a single word acknowledging Malcolm's response. Slowly, Malcolm reached toward the glove compartment. "I'm getting my registration now," he narrated his own movements, his tone steady. "My license is in my wallet. I'll reach for it after this." Bradley didn't respond, but his posture shifted. A small change, but Malcolm caught it. Bradley had expected nervousness, maybe a bit of panic. The usual signs that someone was hiding something. Instead, he was met with calm precision. Bradley's flashlight beam twitched slightly. "You know why I pulled you over?" It was a rhetorical question. A test. Before Malcolm could answer, Bradley continued. "You were driving erratically back there, swerving into the other lane." That was a blatant lie. Malcolm frowned just barely, just enough. "With all due respect, officer, I wasn't swerving. My dash cam can verify that." Bradley's jaw tightened. A flash of irritation, and then a shift in tactics. "Dash cam, huh?" Bradley smirked. That'll be confiscated for evidence. And just like that, Malcolm knew where this was going. He exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel a little firmer, but his face remained neutral. They're looking for a reason. Bradley stepped back, tapping on the side of the SUV with the flashlight. Step out of the vehicle. It wasn't a request. And just like that, the evening had changed. A simple stop had turned into something else entirely. Malcolm hesitated, not out of fear but calculation. He had two choices. Calmly and de-escalate. Get out, let them feel in control, play the game, and hope this ended with nothing more than an inconvenience. Push back legally, verbally. Assert his rights. Question their probable cause. The second option? That could turn a bad situation worse. So, Malcolm moved carefully, his every motion deliberate. He reached for the door handle. No sudden movements. As he stepped out, he kept his hands where they could see them. His badge was inside his coat pocket. The one that would end this immediately if he chose to reveal it. But something told him that wouldn't be enough. Bradley's smirk widened as he looked over Malcolm. You got anything on you I should know about? Before Malcolm could answer, the second officer, Turner, moved in. A hand clamped roughly onto Malcolm's arm, yanking him toward the squad car. Is this necessary? Malcolm asked, his voice controlled but firm. Turner tightened his grip. Resisting? Huh? Bradley sneered. You want to play that game? Fine by me. And then the cold bite of metal snapped around Malcolm's wrists. His stomach turned, not in fear but in absolute certainty. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was profiling. Plain and simple. As he was shoved toward the back seat of the squad car, Malcolm glanced down the street. A few neighbors stood behind their blinds, watching, silent. They wouldn't step outside. But this? This was far from over. Because Bradley and Turner, they had just arrested the man who ran the entire department. And Malcolm wasn't planning to stay silent for long. The squad car rattled slightly as it rolled down the dimly lit streets, carrying Malcolm Hayes toward the one place he never expected to be, the holding cells of his own department. Seated stiffly in the back, his wrists still cuffed, Malcolm stared out the window as familiar landmarks blurred past. The Atlanta Police Department's South Precinct was only a few miles away. He had been there before, countless times, but never like this. From the front seats, officers Bradley and Turner exchanged casual banter as if they hadn't just unlawfully arrested a man for no reason. Bradley, still riding the high of power, adjusted the rearview mirror to look at Malcolm. So, what's your story? He asked, smugness dripping from his tone. Late-night drug run. Or just another guy who thinks he's above the law? Malcolm met his gaze head-on, his face unreadable. I'm just a man trying to get home. Bradley chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, that's what they all say. Turner snorted. Reckless drivers always have an excuse. Malcolm said nothing. He could feel their overconfidence. The way they thought they were in control, they had no idea. As the precinct loomed ahead, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow against the night sky, Malcolm inhaled deeply. He knew what was coming next. Processing. Fingerprints. Mugshot. The routine humiliation. None of it would last, because eventually someone was going to recognize who he was. And when that happened, everything would change. The doors to the squad car swung open, and Malcolm was pulled out with unnecessary force. A few officers loitered near the entrance, watching as Bradley and Turner led their latest catch inside. Some of them barely glanced his way. Others, particularly the younger ones, smirked as if this was just another routine booking. Inside, the precinct was alive with movement. Phones rang, voices echoed, paperwork shuffled. It was the familiar controlled chaos of law enforcement, but tonight, Malcolm was on the wrong side of it. Bradley led him toward the booking desk, where a bored-looking officer, Sergeant Wilkins, sat behind a computer. Middle-aged, overweight, and 2 years from retirement. Wilkins didn't even bother looking up as he muttered, "Name?" Bradley smirked, giving Malcolm a quick glance before answering for him. "John Doe," he said mockingly. "We'll figure out the real name later." Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly, but his face remained calm, controlled. Wilkins sighed, finally looking up, and when he did, something flickered in his expression. A hint of recognition. His eyes narrowed slightly, scanning Malcolm's face. He tilted his head, as if trying to place him, but before he could say anything, Bradley tossed Malcolm's wallet onto the desk. Ran his ID, he said. But I say we hold him till morning. Let him stew a bit. Wilkins raised an eyebrow. On what charge? Bradley didn't hesitate. Reckless driving. Resisting arrest. Wilkins let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Reckless driving? He glanced at Malcolm. You don't look like a reckless driver to me. Bradley's smile twitched. He's got a dash cam, Turner added quickly. We'll be confiscating that. Wilkins let out a long sigh, rubbing his temple. Jesus, you two just love the paperwork, don't you? But he didn't push further. Malcolm took note of that. The clank of metal echoed through the room as the holding cell door slammed shut. Malcolm didn't react. He simply walked to the bench, sat down, and waited. From his seat he could see through the small rectangular window in the door. The precinct buzzed with activity outside, but in here it was silent. Cold. Across the room, Bradley and Turner leaned against a desk, laughing quietly as they skimmed through Malcolm's wallet, registration, and license. Bradley sighed dramatically. Well, would you look at that? He mused, tapping Malcolm's police-issued ID card against his palm. Nothing out of the ordinary, Turner muttered, almost disappointed. Doesn't matter, Bradley smirked. Guys like him. Always got skeletons in the closet. Malcolm heard every word. His expression remained unreadable. They thought this was a game, a joke. But the joke was about to be on them. As the hours dragged on, other officers began to take notice. Some simply passed by the holding cell, giving Malcolm curious glances. Others lingered a second too long. They didn't recognize him. Not yet. But something about him wasn't adding up. And then, finally, Lieutenant Carter arrived. The moment Lieutenant Marcus Carter stepped into the station, the energy shifted. Carter was in his mid-40s, built like a linebacker, with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He wasn't a man to be played with. Not by anyone. He strode past the booking desk, flipping through a folder of reports, when something caught his eye. A name. His brow furrowed. Slowly, he looked up across the precinct toward the holding cell, and then, suddenly, everything clicked. Carter's entire expression changed. His head snapped toward Bradley and Turner, who were still lounging near their desk. What the hell is this? Carter's voice cut through the air like a blade. Bradley and Turner both stiffened. Carter stalked toward them, his eyes locked onto the paperwork. The name. The ID. Tell me, Carter said, his voice low, dangerous. Which one of you two geniuses arrested the damn police chief? Silence. For the first time that night, Bradley and Turner were speechless. Malcolm, still seated on the bench in the holding cell, finally allowed himself a small smile. Because the game? It was over. Lieutenant Marcus Carter stood at the booking desk, eyes burning with restrained fury as he flipped through the paperwork in his hands. His gaze snapped back up to Bradley and Turner, who were frozen like two rookies caught screwing up in front of their training officer. The precinct had gone silent. The usual late-night murmurs of officers swapping stories, the sound of keyboards clicking, even the static from the radio, all of it had faded into a suffocating hush. Carter held up the police report with 2 fingers and tapped it against his palm. Let me get this straight, he said, his voice measured but sharp enough to cut glass. You stopped a man who was driving within the speed limit. You pulled him from his car. You arrested him. He let the words hang in the air, heavy and deliberate. And at no goddamn point did you run his name properly. Neither officer spoke. Bradley swallowed hard, his cocky demeanor crumbling by the second. Turner looked like he wished he could disappear into the floor. Carter took a slow step forward, the weight of his authority pressing down like a storm cloud. You 2 idiots have been sitting here for the past 3 hours holding the goddamn chief of police in a cell. Gasps rippled through the room. A few younger officers exchanged panicked glances. A sergeant at the far desk stiffened, his hands pausing mid-typing. Bradley's face went pale. Turner shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively rubbing the back of his neck. I mean we were going to process him in the morning, sir, Bradley finally stammered, grasping for an excuse. Carter's nostrils flared. You were going to process the highest-ranking officer in the department in the morning? He repeated, voice dripping with disbelief. Are you actually hearing yourself right now? Carter inhaled sharply, then snapped his fingers. Get me the damn dashcam footage. Now. Within minutes, the precinct's AV officer had pulled up the footage from Malcolm's car. The moment it flashed onto the screen, there was no denying the truth. The speedometer, 30th. The lane, perfectly straight. The stop, completely unprovoked. Then came the body cam footage, and with it, the final nail in the coffin. Bradley's voice echoed through the room, another one of them causing trouble. Turner's chuckle followed. Cold and careless figures. The room tensed. Eyes shifted toward Bradley and Turner, who now looked like men standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing too late that they'd stepped too far. Carter exhaled slowly, shaking his head. His disgust was palpable. "You dumb sons of bitches," he muttered. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the holding cells. Malcolm sat exactly where he had been for the past few hours, calm, composed, unreadable. As Carter approached, he stood slowly, stretching his shoulders. His gaze met Carter's without an ounce of anger, but with an unmistakable weight. Carter sighed. "Chief." Malcolm arched a brow. "Lieutenant." A long silence stretched between them. Then Carter's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Sir, I need you to know I had no idea this was happening. If I did, it wouldn't have gone this far." Malcolm studied him for a moment, then gave a slow, measured nod. "I believe you." Relief flickered across Carter's face. But Malcolm wasn't done. He turned his gaze toward the two men standing several feet behind Carter, Bradley and Turner. Both men were stiff as boards, their arrogance from earlier now shattered beyond repair. Malcolm let the silence stretch long enough that the two officers began shifting on their feet. Then, finally, he spoke. "You two have spent the last few hours," he said slowly, his voice smooth but heavy, laughing, mocking, assuming that you were in control. Bradley swallowed but said nothing. "You thought you had the power in this situation," Malcolm continued, "but you never did." His eyes locked onto Bradley's. "You just didn't know who you were dealing with." A sharp exhale escaped Bradley's lips. Turner glanced at the floor, as if trying to avoid the weight of Malcolm's words. Malcolm stepped forward, just enough to force them to look at him. "I was never afraid of you," he said. "And that," he added after a pause, "is what really pisses you off, isn't it?" Bradley flinched as if struck, because Malcolm was right. Deep down, Bradley had wanted to see fear, compliance, subservience. But Malcolm had never given him any of it. He had simply waited. Waited for the moment when their own actions would damn them. And that moment had finally arrived. Carter turned toward Bradley and Turner. His voice was stone. "Both of you. In my office. Now." The two men hesitated, then quickly nodded, walking off like condemned men heading toward the gallows. Carter turned back to Malcolm. "I've already called internal affairs," he said. "They'll be launching a formal investigation." Malcolm nodded. It was a start. But they both knew this was far from over. Carter exhaled, then motioned for the booking sergeant to unlock the cell. "Let's get you the hell out of here, Chief." The door swung open with a heavy clang. Malcolm stepped out, rolling his shoulders as if shedding the last remnants of the night. The precinct was watching now. Every officer. Every sergeant. Every rookie who had been too afraid to speak up before. And Malcolm saw the same thing on every face. Shock, guilt. And, in some cases, fear. Because this was just the beginning. Malcolm adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and gave Carter a small nod. "Let's go to my office." A beat of silence. Then Carter nodded back. And with that, Chief Malcolm Hayes walked out of the holding area no longer just a man wrongfully arrested, but a man ready to burn the system to the ground and rebuild it the right way. Because change wasn't just coming, it had already begun. The hallway leading to Chief Malcolm Hayes' office had never felt longer. The walls, lined with photos of past police chiefs, seemed to loom over him. Some of the men in those frames had fought for progress. Others had simply upheld the status quo. Malcolm had no intention of being like the latter. Beside him, Lieutenant Marcus Carter walked in tense silence, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. The entire precinct was watching them now, their whispers hanging thick in the air like fog. Every step Malcolm took was a message. To those who had laughed at his arrest, their time of unchecked power was running out. To those who had stayed silent, Their complacency wouldn't protect them anymore. To those who wanted change but had been afraid to speak up, now was their moment. As Malcolm and Carter reached the chief's office, Malcolm stopped just outside the door and turned toward Carter. "Close the door behind you," Malcolm said, stepping inside. Carter obeyed, shutting the world out. The office was Spartan, barely lived in. Malcolm had only been on the job for 3 weeks after all. A few personal effects sat on the desk, a framed photo of his wife and daughter, a small plaque from his former department, and a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. Malcolm walked to the window, staring out at the city beyond. Atlanta, his city. Behind him, Carter cleared his throat. "Chief, Malcolm raised a hand, silencing him. He turned, his eyes sharp, his voice calm but unyielding. "How many?" Malcolm asked. Carter frowned. "Sir?" "How many times," Malcolm repeated, "have those two pulled this stunt before?" Carter exhaled through his nose. "I don't have an exact number, but it's not the first time." Carter hesitated just for a second, but Malcolm caught it. "No, sir," Carter admitted. "It's not." Malcolm nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And yet, they're still wearing badges." Carter had no answer for that. Malcolm stepped toward his desk, resting his hands on the smooth wooden surface. "Bradley and Turner aren't the real problem," Malcolm said, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. Carter frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, they're symptoms of the disease, Carter," Malcolm interrupted. "The problem is a culture that lets them operate like this. The problem is that everyone knew what they were doing, and no one stopped them." Carter clenched his jaw but didn't argue, because he knew Malcolm was right. Malcolm straightened, his shoulders broad, his presence commanding. "This department has a choice to make," he said. "And I need to know, where do you stand?" Carter met his gaze without hesitation. "With you, sir," he said firmly. Malcolm studied him, then gave a single nod. "Good." The department-wide meeting was called within the hour. Inside the large briefing room, nearly every officer from the precinct was gathered, some standing against the walls, others seated, but all waiting to see what the new police chief had to say. Some looked uneasy. Some looked defensive. A few, even those who had once laughed, looked nervous. Malcolm let the silence settle. Then he stepped forward, his presence commanding the room without effort. "What happened to me last night," he began, his voice even, "was not an accident." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one dared speak up. Malcolm's gaze swept across the room, lingering on those he knew had been complicit. "This isn't about a bad traffic stop," he continued. "This isn't about 2 officers making a mistake. This is about a culture that protects bad cops and punishes the people who speak up." Silence. Uncomfortable, thick silence. Malcolm nodded to Carter, who clicked a remote. A screen lit up behind them. The dashcam footage played. The body cam audio followed. Another one of them causing trouble. Figures. A few officers shifted in their seats. A few paled. The recording ended. Malcolm folded his hands in front of him. "If you're wondering why this footage is being shown here, instead of on the 6 o'clock news, it's because I believe in giving people a chance to fix their mistakes before the world forces them to." His voice hardened. "But understand me, this is the last chance." A few heads nodded, subtle but telling. Others looked defiant. Malcolm saw them all. "Bradley and Turner are being placed on immediate unpaid suspension pending an internal affairs investigation. If it were up to me, their badges would already be on my desk." Someone scoffed. Malcolm's head snapped toward the source. "Sergeant Douglas," Malcolm said coolly, addressing the older white officer in the back who had his arms crossed. "You have something you'd like to say?" Douglas straightened slightly, clearly not expecting to be called out directly, but he didn't back down. "With all due respect, Chief," Douglas said, "this feels a little like a witch hunt." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "A witch hunt?" Douglas exhaled, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of Malcolm's gaze. "Sir, those officers did what they thought was necessary for officer safety." A few others in the room nodded slightly, not outright supporting Douglas, but not willing to oppose him either. Malcolm let that sit for a beat. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but razor sharp. "So tell me, Sergeant, at what point was I a threat?" Douglas hesitated. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the audio. At what point was I a threat?" Silence. Malcolm took a slow step forward. "You want to talk about officer safety?" Malcolm continued, his voice deadly calm. Fine. Let's talk about public safety. Let's talk about the black father driving home, who doesn't have a badge in his pocket. Let's talk about the teenager who fits the description. Let's talk about the men who don't get to walk away from situations like mine. Douglas looked away. But Malcolm wasn't finished. If you think accountability is a witch hunt, he said, then you're the problem. Silence. Malcolm let it stretch. Let the weight of his words settle on the room like a storm cloud. Then he nodded toward Carter. Lieutenant, effective immediately, every officer in this precinct is required to attend mandatory bias and de-escalation training. No exceptions. A few officers murmured. Others clenched their jaws. Malcolm didn't care. This is not a request, he said simply. This is the future of this department. Get on board or find another job. With that, Malcolm turned and walked out. By the time Malcolm reached his office, Carter was already there, arms crossed. You made some enemies today, Carter said. Malcolm shrugged. I'm not here to make friends. Carter smirked. Yeah, well, you made some allies too. Malcolm exhaled, glancing back at the precinct. He could already feel the shift. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. And this was only the beginning. The news broke before Malcolm even had a chance to sit down. Somewhere between the meeting and the walk back to his office, the department's internal drama had become public knowledge. By the time he settled into his chair, his phone was already vibrating. Texts, missed calls, emails flooding his inbox. Denise. His wife's name flashed across the screen, her message short and to the point, tell me you're okay. Malcolm sighed, rubbing his forehead before sending back a simple reply, I'm fine. I'll call you soon. The truth. He wasn't sure how fine he was. Because while Bradley and Turner had been suspended, while he had made it very clear that this department wasn't going to operate on unchecked power anymore, the battle had only just begun. A knock at his door. Lieutenant Marcus Carter stepped in, a tense look on his face. You need to see this, Carter said, holding up his phone. Malcolm took it, his stomach already tightening. The screen displayed a breaking news alert. Breaking nebulous, Atlanta police chief detained in wrongful arrest incident. Sources confirmed that newly appointed Atlanta police chief Malcolm Hayes was detained late last night by officers within his own department in what some are calling a clear case of racial profiling. Internal Affairs has launched an investigation into officers Bradley and Turner, both of whom have been placed on unpaid suspension. In a statement earlier today, Chief Hayes vowed sweeping reforms within the department, a move that has already sparked controversy among officers and community leaders alike. Malcolm exhaled, scrolling further. The article was everywhere. CNN, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Even national outlets like the Washington Post had picked it up. And then there were the comments. Some were supportive. Finally, a police chief who knows what it's like on the other side. We need more people like him in charge. This is exactly why we need accountability. If they can do this to the chief, imagine what they do to everyday people. But others. Oh great, another cop playing the race card. Maybe he should have just listened to the officers instead of trying to act superior. We don't need reform. We need law and order. Malcolm handed the phone back to Carter. I take it the mayor has called? Malcolm asked dryly. Carter nodded. 3 times. Malcolm sighed. Guess I'd better not keep him waiting. The mayor's office smelled like old money, leather-bound books, aged whiskey, the faint scent of cigars from whoever had last sat in the chair across from the mayor. Mayor Robert Calloway was a man who had spent his entire career balancing the tightrope between political survival and public perception. He was a middle-aged white man with a practiced politician's smile and the kind of handshake that could mean anything. Malcolm, Calloway greeted, gesturing toward the seat across from his desk. You've had quite the week. Malcolm didn't return the smile. Let's skip the small talk, Robert, Malcolm said, settling into the chair. You called me here for a reason. Calloway sighed, leaning back in his seat. You're making my job difficult, Malcolm. Malcolm arched a brow. Am I? You know you are, Calloway said, folding his hands. The press is running wild with this. The community is angry. Half the city is calling for those officers to be fired, and the other half thinks you're about to turn this department into some kind of political experiment. Malcolm didn't blink. So which half are you worried about? Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. I need to know where this is going, Malcolm, Calloway said, his voice carefully measured. What's your plan? How do we make this go away? Malcolm leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I'm not making it go away. Calloway exhaled through his nose. Malcolm, you hired me because you wanted reform, Malcolm cut in. Or at least, that's what you told the public when you brought me in. But what you really wanted was someone to give the illusion of change, while keeping everything business as usual. Calloway said nothing. Malcolm's voice hardened. That's not how this is going to work. Calloway's jaw tightened. You're playing a dangerous game, the mayor warned. Malcolm tilted his head. No, I'm fixing a broken system. And if that's a problem for you, then you should have hired someone else. A tense silence settled between them. Then, slowly, Calloway sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The city's watching, Malcolm, he said. Don't make me regret backing you. Malcolm stood. Then don't stand in my way. With that, he turned and walked out. That evening, Malcolm stood in the basement of a local church, facing a crowd of concerned citizens. The town hall had been scheduled weeks ago, but after the news broke, it had quickly turned into a public forum on police reform. At the front of the room, Malcolm sat beside a panel of community leaders, faith leaders, activists, business owners. A man in the crowd stood up. He was in his late 30s, wearing a hoodie and jeans, his face tense with contained frustration. My name is Andre Williams, he said. I've lived in this city my whole life. And I gotta be real with you. Chief Hayes, what happened to you? He shook his head. It happens to us every damn day. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. You got to walk out of that cell, Andre continued. Most of us don't. More voices rose in agreement. A woman near the back wiped at her eyes. Malcolm let the words sink in. Then he took the microphone. You're right, he said simply. Andre's brows furrowed. He hadn't been expecting that. Malcolm continued. You're right, he repeated. What happened to me wasn't unique. It wasn't special. It was just another Tuesday night for too many black men in this country. The room was silent now. Listening. The only difference. Malcolm said. I had the power to do something about it. He took a breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. And I intend to use that power. As Malcolm left the town hall, Carter was waiting for him outside. You sure you want this fight? Carter asked. Malcolm looked out over the city, the skyline glowing against the night sky. This fight was already here, he said. I'm just finally in a position to do something about it. Carter nodded, his expression firm. Then let's get to work. And just like that, the war for the soul of the department had officially begun. The storm had arrived. The morning after the town hall, the weight of the department's reckoning bore down on Chief Malcolm Hayes like an iron fist. Every major news outlet was running the story. Calls from City Hall wouldn't stop. Officers in the precinct were divided. Some had finally begun to speak up, quietly supporting Malcolm's push for reform. Others, they wanted him gone. And now the real fight was beginning. At exactly 9 a.m., Malcolm walked into the Internal Affairs conference room. The walls were sterile white, the air thick with tension. Sitting across the table were 3 Iowa investigators, their expressions blank, neutral to neutral. Lieutenant Marcus Carter stood at Malcolm's side, arms crossed, watching everyone in the room like a hawk. At the head of the table sat Captain Elaine Foster, head of Iowa, a sharp, calculating woman in her late 40s, notorious for choosing her battles carefully. Chief Hayes, Foster greeted coolly, gesturing toward a seat. Malcolm took it. Carter remained standing. Before we begin, Foster said, lacing her fingers together, I want to make something clear. This investigation is not a witch hunt. Malcolm's lips curled into something just shy of a smirk. That's good to hear, he said, because I don't have time for games. Foster tilted her head slightly, measuring him. Let's talk about Officers Bradley and Turner, she said. You had them placed on unpaid suspension pending review. Based on the available evidence, I'd say that was the right call. But, Malcolm prompted, already sensing the pushback. But Foster continued, flipping through a folder. The union is already contesting their suspension. Their lawyer is arguing that your involvement in this case is a conflict of interest. Malcolm scoffed. A conflict of interest? Foster nodded. They claim that since you were the one wrongfully detained, you're too close to the case to make an unbiased decision regarding their punishment. Carter let out a sharp breath. That's ridiculous. It's a tactic, Malcolm said calmly, already calculating his next move. One meant to slow this investigation down. Foster shrugged. Maybe. But legally speaking, they have a case. The review board will likely rule that any final decision about Bradley and Turner needs to come from someone other than you. Malcolm leaned back, arms crossed. They wanted to play chess. Fine. Then who makes the decision? Foster sighed, closing the folder. The Civilian Oversight Committee. Malcolm went still. The Civilian Oversight Committee, a group of city-appointed officials, half of whom were more concerned with keeping the peace politically than actually holding officers accountable. And just like that, Malcolm saw the game for what it was. This wasn't about justice. It was about containment. They were trying to bury this. Later that day, Malcolm sat in his office, watching a press conference unfold on his monitor. The Atlanta Police Union president, Daniel Wilcox, stood at a podium, flanked by a row of officers who looked like they had just walked out of a bad cop drama. Wilcox was a career union man. Late 50s, bald, heavyset, with a voice that carried authority. And right now, he was spinning the hell out of the narrative. We support accountability in law enforcement, Wilcox declared, his voice oozing with forced sincerity. But what we don't support is a politically motivated attack on two officers who were just trying to do their jobs. Malcolm let out a low, humorless laugh. The media ate it up. This so-called reform effort, Wilcox continued, is nothing more than a knee-jerk reaction to an unfortunate misunderstanding. Chief Hayes is trying to make an example out of good officers, and we won't stand for it. Carter, standing near Malcolm's desk, turned off the monitor. You seeing this shit? Carter muttered. Oh, I see it, Malcolm said, standing up. Wilcox wasn't just fighting for Bradley and Turner. He was testing the waters, seeing if he could rally enough officers to push Malcolm out before real changes took hold. You're going to have to hit back, Carter said. Malcolm nodded. Yeah, but not the way they expect. That evening, Malcolm called for an emergency meeting with the Civilian Oversight Committee. Most of them had expected him to fight against their involvement, to argue that the department should handle its own discipline. Instead, Malcolm walked into that room with a proposal. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice calm but firm. I won't fight your ruling that I can't make the final decision on Bradley and Turner. In fact, I welcome it. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. But if you're going to take this out of my hands, Malcolm continued, leaning forward, then we're going to do it the right way. He pulled out a file and slid it across the table. This is a proposal to expand civilian oversight over officer misconduct cases moving forward. Not just for this case, but for every excessive force complaint that comes through the department. Some of the committee members looked genuinely intrigued. Others, uncomfortable. One of them, an older white woman named Elaine Maddox, frowned. Chief Hayes, are you suggesting that we take direct control over disciplinary actions? I'm suggesting that the public deserves a say in how their police department operates, Malcolm corrected. If you're going to intervene in this case, then it's only fair you be responsible for all cases like it. Silence. It was a bold move. If they accepted it, the community would have more power than ever before. If they refused, they'd expose themselves as hypocrites. Either way, Malcolm won. News of Malcolm's proposal spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, social media was on fire. The chief just flipped the script on them. Cops wanted due process. Well, now they're getting it. Civilian oversight is long overdue. Let's see if they actually go through with it. The pressure shifted, and for the first time, Wilcox and the police union were on the defensive. Back at the precinct, Carter walked into Malcolm's office, shaking his head in disbelief. You really just forced them into a corner, Carter said. Malcolm smirked. They wanted a fight. They got one. Carter exhaled. So what happens next? Malcolm leaned back in his chair. Now, he said, watching the sunset outside his window. Now we see if they actually have the guts to stand by their own rules. And deep down, Malcolm knew the answer. This was far from over. But one thing was clear. The system was shaking, and Malcolm Hayes wasn't done yet. The city was on edge. In the days following Malcolm's push for expanded civilian oversight, the balance of power in Atlanta's police department had begun to shift in ways no one had anticipated. Some officers, the ones who had been waiting for change but had never felt safe enough to speak up, began stepping forward. Others, the ones who had thrived under the old system, were fighting tooth and nail to stop it. And now, as Malcolm sat in his office, the phone pressed to his ear, he knew the battle was about to come to a head. Because the Civilian Oversight Committee had reached a decision, and they were about to announce it to the world. The conference room at City Hall was packed. News cameras lined the back wall, reporters jostling for the best angles. The energy in the room was tense, electric. Seated at the long table were the 7 members of the Civilian Oversight Committee, their faces unreadable. At the head of the table, Elaine Maddox cleared her throat, glancing down at the prepared statement in front of her. Malcolm sat in the first row, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Lieutenant Carter sat with his arms crossed, scanning the room like a soldier preparing for battle. Maddox took a deep breath. "After reviewing all available evidence," she said, her voice steady but hesitant, "the Oversight Committee has ruled that Officers Bradley and Turner—" She paused. And in that pause, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. "Are to be terminated from the Atlanta Police Department, effective immediately." The room exploded. Reporters shouted over each other. Cameras flashed. Some people cheered. Others, especially the off-duty officers who had shown up to support Bradley and Turner, looked like they had just been punched in the gut. Malcolm exhaled slowly. It was a win. But he wasn't celebrating yet, because the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back at the precinct, the Union's response was swift and ruthless. Within hours, Wilcox held his own press conference, standing in front of a crowd of officers, many of whom wore expressions of thinly veiled rage. "This decision," Wilcox growled into the microphone, "is nothing more than a politically motivated attack on law enforcement." He let the words settle, then went for the kill. "And if Chief Hayes thinks we're just going to sit back and take it, he's got another thing coming." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Wilcox turned to the cameras, eyes burning with challenge. "Effective immediately. The Atlanta Police Union is calling for a vote of no confidence against Chief Malcolm Hayes." When Malcolm returned to his office, he wasn't surprised to see Mayor Calloway waiting for him. "You expected this, didn't you?" Malcolm said, closing the door behind him. Calloway sighed, rubbing his temples. "Malcolm, you've made a lot of enemies." "Good," Malcolm said flatly. "That means I'm doing something right." Calloway shook his head. "The Union's vote is symbolic, but you and I both know what it really means." "They want my head," Malcolm said. "They want you gone," Calloway corrected. "And they might get their wish." Silence. Then Calloway leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Malcolm, you need to walk this back." Malcolm froze. Calloway kept going. "Let Bradley and Turner appeal. Make a statement about building bridges with the department. Give them something, Malcolm. Because if you don't, this city is going to turn on you." Malcolm's stomach tightened. It wasn't just the mayor's words. It was the implication. Calloway wasn't just giving advice. He was giving an ultimatum. "Let me guess," Malcolm said, his voice like steel. "If I don't play nice, I lose your support." Calloway exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I'm trying to help you, Malcolm." "No," Malcolm said, standing up. "You're trying to help yourself." Calloway opened his mouth, then closed it. Because they both knew the truth. This was about politics. And Malcolm didn't play that game. That night, Malcolm sat at his desk, staring at the city through the window. He knew what was coming. The Union would fight harder. The mayor would distance himself. Some officers, maybe a lot of them, would turn against him. And yet, despite everything, Malcolm wasn't afraid. Because fear had never been the problem. The problem had always been silence. And he refused to be silent any longer. He picked up his phone and dialed Carter. "You got a minute?" Malcolm asked. "Always," Carter said. Malcolm exhaled. "Tomorrow morning we're calling a press conference." Carter chuckled. "Damn! You're really about to light this whole place on fire, huh?" Malcolm smiled. "No, Carter. I'm about to rebuild it." The next morning, Malcolm stood in front of a sea of reporters, the entire city watching. Behind him, a group of community leaders, civil rights advocates, and officers who still believed in real policing stood as a silent wall of support. Malcolm took a deep breath, then leaned into the microphone. "The people of Atlanta," he said, his voice steady, "deserve a police department that works for them, not against them." A murmur went through the crowd, and to the officers out there who believe in real justice, who put on that uniform to serve and protect, not to abuse power, I see you, and I stand with you. Malcolm's expression hardened. "But for those who think they can intimidate me, for those who believe that by resisting accountability they can keep things the way they were." He let the moment hang, then delivered the final blow. "You're already losing." And with that, Malcolm stepped back. Because he had said all he needed to say. Now, the city would decide. The days that followed were chaos. The union's vote of no confidence passed, but it didn't remove Malcolm from power. Officers resigned in protest, but more young recruits, hungry for real change, stepped in. The community rallied behind Malcolm, demanding continued reform. And Malcolm, he was still there. Still fighting. Still standing. Because this was never about one arrest. This was about something bigger. A fight that had started long before him. A fight that would continue long after him. But as long as he held this position, as long as he had this voice, he would use it. Because the battle for justice was just getting started. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.